It basically didn't want to be simply included in a liberal democratic system. It wanted to change the nature of that system. And the key figures here was the Pankhurst family, the women of the Pankhurst family, Emily Pankhurst and her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia. The Women's Social and Political Union was responsible for dramatising the exclusion of women in increasingly dramatic ways, by chaining themselves to railings, by setting arson attacks on public buildings, on mailboxes, and most dramatically, by undergoing hunger strikes when they were arrested for disturbances of the public peace. Now, some sense of the nature of this movement is apparent in Christabel, and the influence of Butler is apparent in Christabel Pankhurst's book, The Great Scourge, published in 1913, which argued that 75% of men had an STD and were destroying Britain's imperial race, and that only the enfranchisement of women could restore social purity and the health of the nation and the empire. And her phrase that she frequently used was votes for women, chastity for men. And yet unrealised concept. Many of the people involved in this movement, and indeed in the NUWSS, also become involved, and Josephine Butler is a great example of this, in the cause of imperial social reform. That is, seeking to improve the condition of women across the empire, of trying to civilise colonial women by their own interventions upon them. I don't have time to go into that because they'll come up in a later lecture. I'm just signalling it to you now. I was going to show you a movement of Christabel Pankhurst getting arrested, but we'll move on because time is short. So finally, I want to talk to you about how women actually end up getting the vote. The irony is, in many ways, that neither of the two arguments proposed by the women's suffrage movement were ultimately successful. Women get the vote in 1918. And they get the vote in a very partial way. A partial way that they had completely refused to countenance before the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. They would refuse to accept any compromise that did not enfranchise all women at once. And in 1918, after the declaration of peace in the First World War, they get the vote with the Representation of the People's Act, but not all women get the vote. So why do they accept this, and how does it happen? It's important to remember that all suffrage organisations, or pretty much all the main suffrage organisations, suspended their campaigns for the vote immediately with the declaration of war in August 1914. Campaigning for the vote was considered to be an unpatriotic thing, and the women's suffrage movement wanted to show that they were good citizens that would patriotically support the war effort. And women, as we know, became hugely involved in that war effort, and I'll talk to you about this in a later lecture, but they're deeply involved in munitions work, in nursing, and in voluntary food rationing, in the running of their households. So in 1918, comes not as a consequence of any great campaign by the women's movement. The women's movement basically gone silent for 4 years. What 1918 does, which is hugely important, is to break the connection between the vote and the possession of property. Okay? That had been enshrined in the Reform Act of 1832, and it was decisively broken in 1918. All men got the vote. But some men were denied the vote still. Conscientious objectors, who had refused to fight during the war, were had their vote removed, and so did any man on poor relief, or indeed any person on poor relief, or in prison. Women, in contrast, got the vote in 3 types of ways. They got it in reward for their military service. Something like over 3,000 women qualify for the vote for this, having worked for the Red Cross or the Auxiliary Army Corps as nurses, or as, doing support work. Second way was they got the vote as part of the university franchise, because amazingly, some universities had their own franchise, because it was thought that undergraduates were the most rational of all potential citizens, and so therefore they had to be encouraged to vote, and they were given a university franchise in addition to their franchise in their permanent residence. So if you're a university student, you had 2 votes, because you are the blessed of the earth, so rational, so literate, so sensible, you have to vote twice. And that franchise actually runs down to 1945. It's not finally abolished until 1945. The last way that women got the vote was as in relation to property. And they got it because they were either householders in their own right, or they were the wife of a property holder. And all of these categories had to be over 30. There was an age distinction there. Because it was feared if you enfranchised all women, there would suddenly be a surplus of women voters. Something like 750,000 men had died during the First World War, so that created a huge discrepancy between the numbers of, would have created a huge discrepancy between the numbers of men voters and women voters, and the last thing you could possibly have is more women voting than men, because Lord knows what would happen then. And yet the irony is it's those women under 30 who had primarily been responsible for much of the service during the war, as nurses, as support workers, as munition workers, etc., etc. It's not until 1928 that fear of the discrepancy between numbers was finally removed and all women get the vote. And again, that happens with no mass mobilisation by the women's movement. It's quite an extraordinary thing. It sort of just unfolds almost by default and introduced by a Conservative government. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, because women proved to be very good supporters of the Conservative Party. When women finally got the vote, they were far from the radical, unleashed sects on the march that many feared. They ended up to be good, sound supporters of the Conservative Party. Okay, so let me finish up. You can tell, I hope, that we've ended up in a slightly different place at the end of this lecture to the account provided by the first generation of feminist scholars in the 1970s. It's not just male historians who are responsible for this less triumphalist account. Many feminist scholars have been primarily responsible for this less triumphal story that I'm telling you today. In effect, the argument is now, and this has chiefly been made by actually a former Berkeley PhD called Nicola Galaci, but also by other important feminist historians like Antoinette Burton, that the suffrage comes to women primarily as a consequence less of their radical mobilization and more of the influence of nationalism and imperialism and racism. Women's emancipation came as a consequence of their patriotic embrace of the war effort and of the imperial project, not of the radical critiques of the liberal state and the nature of liberal democracy. I think we have to be very careful about this argument. I think it helps explain why it is that women get the vote in 1918, but I don't think there's any way that women would have got the vote in 1918 if the force of women's criticisms and mobilizations before the war are not taken very seriously indeed. As I said at the beginning of the class, what the women's movement does is basically expose some of the central contradictions of the new liberal common sense that came to predominate in the 19th century. It exposed, for instance, that there was a real uneven work of gender in the 19th century. That, while the married middle classes may have approached something close to the ideal of separate spheres, really nobody else did. Nobody else did. Working women were forced to work all of their lives. And even respectable middle-class women increasingly become engaged in public activities, not least through shopping and through charitable endeavour. Indeed, the women's movement helps expose the connection between the angel in the home and the fallen woman. They try and suggest that there is a connection between the very different types of subjugation for both of those women. Both of them are subjected to a form of male patriarchy and subjugation. Both of them are exposed to the double standards of so-called the moral protection of women in the household. But I want to end up by just reminding you of the really massive advances in the position of women that occur in the second half of the 19th century. The expansion of their personal opportunities, of their professional opportunities, of the political opportunities. It doesn't end the subjugation of women, for sure. The feminist movement had a lot more work to do in the 20th century, but it provided a really important platform for the next generation of feminist mobilization in the 20th century. And I think that the dilemma that we all have as historians is trying to figure out quite what is the relationship of this women's movement of the 19th century with the liberalism that had become the common sense of this age. It is both a product of it, and yet it provides a source of criticism of it at the same time. So do we think of the advances of the women's movement in the 19th century as part of the fulfillment of the liberal project that I've been talking about, or as part of its undoing? And on that delicious puzzle, I will leave you for another day.